Hello there, and welcome back. I'm glad you found your way here tonight. Maybe your day has been loud, maybe your thoughts have been circling for a while, or maybe you simply want a quiet story to rest inside while the world slows down. There is nothing you need to solve right now. Let your shoulders loosen, let your breathing settle, and let the room around you become a little softer. Tonight, we are riding into the long, sad story of Arthur Morgan, not as a loud tale of gunfights and robberies, but as something slower, heavier, and more human. Arthur's story is a tragedy because it does not fall on him all at once. It gathers around him. It begins in loyalty, in family, in old promises, in the warmth of a campfire, in the voice of a man he trusts too much. Then it moves through sickness, guilt, doubt, and the awful recognition that the people we love can become the very thing we have to escape. It is a story about a violent man who still had tenderness buried inside him, a dying man who became more alive in his conscience as his body failed, and an outlaw who could not save himself, but could still save something. So let the night be gentle for a while. Let the snow of Coulter fall quietly in the distance. Let the horses breathe in the dark. Let the campfire crackle somewhere beyond the trees. We will move slowly through Arthur Morgan's life, from the first signs of loyalty to the last sunrise on the mountain, and along the way we will follow the sadness that makes him one of the most unforgettable characters in Red Dead Redemption 2. Arthur Morgan's story begins before the game truly lets us meet him, because by the time Red Dead Redemption 2 opens, Arthur is already a man shaped by years of violence, loyalty, hunger, and quiet disappointment. He's not introduced as a wide-eyed hero waiting to become good. He's introduced as a hardened outlaw riding through a blizzard with a gang that is already wounded. The ferry job in Blackwater has failed. The gang has lost money, lost people, lost safety, and lost the illusion that Dutch always knows how to lead them out of trouble. Arthur is there in the snow, broad-shouldered and tired, trusting Dutch because trust is almost a reflex in him. He has followed Dutch for most of his life. He has been raised inside Dutch's dream so long that questioning it feels almost like questioning the ground beneath his feet. The first thing that makes Arthur interesting is that he is not soft. But he is not hollow either. He can threaten people, beat people, rob people, and kill people without pretending he is innocent. He has spent years doing ugly work for the Van der Linde gang. Yet the story lets small pieces of kindness show through him almost immediately. He worries about John in the snow even while insulting him. He helps find food. He listens when people speak to him. He can be gruff with the weak, but he also notices weakness with a kind of embarrassed concern. That tension is the seed of his entire arc. Arthur is a brutal man with a conscience he has spent years trying to treat as an inconvenience. When Arthur rides with Javier to find John Marston near Coulter, the relationship between the two men is already complicated. Arthur mocks John, calls him foolish, remembers that John once abandoned the gang for a year, and clearly resents how easily Dutch forgave him. But Arthur still goes. He still climbs through the freezing wind to bring him back. That is Arthur's emotional pattern in miniature. He complains, he insults, he acts like he does not care, and then he does the caring thing anyway. His love often arrives wearing the mask of annoyance, because tenderness is difficult for him to speak plainly. Dutch and Hosea are the two fathers standing behind Arthur's identity. Dutch gives him language, fire, and belief. Hosea gives him patience, humour, and a sense of limits. Arthur was taken in as a young boy after losing his parents, and the gang became not simply a crew, but a replacement world. He learned to read people, shoot, rob, survive, and think of himself as part of a cause. Dutch did not merely teach Arthur how to be an outlaw. Dutch taught Arthur that outlaw life could be moral, even noble, if it stood against greed, banks, corruption, and the cruelty of civilization. Hosea, meanwhile, seems to have given Arthur a quieter lesson, that charm can be useful, that violence is not always the smartest answer, and that every con needs an exit before pride turns it into a disaster. That is why Arthur's loyalty is not simple stupidity. He does not follow Dutch because he has no mind of his own. He follows Dutch because Dutch gave him a life when he had none. The loyalty is emotional debt, family habit, survival instinct, and belief all tangled together. Arthur knows the gang does bad things, but he also knows the people in camp. He knows Jack's laughter, Abigail's worry, Pearson's stew, Hosea's jokes, Javier's songs, Tilly's strength, Mary Beth's stories, Lenny's intelligence, Charles's quiet decency, and Sadie's grief. To leave Dutch would not feel like leaving an employer. It would feel like betraying the only family that ever made room for him. In Coulter, Arthur's arc is still buried under work. Survival leaves little space for self-examination. The gang needs shelter, money, food, and a way down from the mountains. Arthur becomes the hand that reaches into the cold and brings back whatever the group needs. He helps rescue Sadie Adler from the ruins of her home after the O'Driscolls murder her husband. His first reaction to Sadie's situation is not poetic compassion. He is practical, blunt, and suspicious, but he brings her in. He makes space for another broken person because that is what the gang does at its best. The Van der Linde family, before it collapses, survives by absorbing the wounded. The early O'Driscoll conflict also shows Arthur as a man trained by feud. Colm O'Driscoll is not just an enemy. He is an old wound that Dutch keeps reopening. Arthur participates in the violence because the feud is part of the gang's inherited reality. The raid on the O'Driscoll camp, the train robbery plans, the talk of revenge and old scores, all of it places Arthur inside a world where loyalty means picking up a gun before asking whether the cycle should continue. Arthur is capable of questioning little things, but not yet the larger machine. He will complain about Dutch's schemes, but he still rides into them. After the gang reaches Horseshoe Overlook, Arthur's character has room to breathe. The snow gives way to green woods, open sky, and a camp that feels almost peaceful. This is where we begin to see Arthur not just as muscle, but as a man with routines, relationships, irritations, and private thoughts. He writes in his journal. He sketches animals, buildings, people, and strange sights. He records events with a mixture of dry humour and surprising sensitivity. The journal is one of the deepest windows into Arthur because it reveals the part of him that observes more than he says. Out loud, he can be harsh. On the page, he notices beauty. That journal matters because it proves Arthur has always had an inner life beyond the outlaw role. He draws flowers, horses, birds, churches, mountains, and faces. He writes about people with judgment, but also with care. He is not a man incapable of reflection. He is a man who has been trained to keep reflection private. The gang needs him to be dependable, frightening, and strong. His journal lets him be curious and uncertain without having to perform weakness in front of anyone. In a story about a man learning to face himself, that quiet book is almost sacred. Horseshoe also lets us see Arthur's place inside the camp hierarchy. Dutch is the voice, Hosea is the brain, Arthur is the backbone. People come to him because he can get things done. He collects debts for Strauss, hunts with Charles, drinks with Lenny, helps Hosea with scams, rides with Dutch, and handles danger when danger becomes unavoidable. That usefulness gives Arthur status, but it also traps him. A man who is always needed can avoid asking what he needs. Arthur can keep moving from job to job, mission to mission, errand to errand, because stopping would mean listening to the unease underneath. His relationship with Uncle, Bill, Javier, and Sean and the rest of the men often sounds rough, but beneath the insults there is a language of belonging. Arthur can call someone lazy, stupid, reckless or drunk, and it can still be a form of affection. The gang's intimacy is not gentle in the way polite families might pretend to be gentle. It is built out of teasing, shared danger, and the knowledge that any ride may end with bullets. Arthur fits that language perfectly. He is not good at saying I love you, but he is good at showing up armed when someone is in trouble. Then there is Mary Linton, the wound from Arthur's life outside the gang. Mary is important because she reminds us that Arthur once imagined another path, or at least stood close enough to one to feel its warmth. Their past relationship did not fail because they never loved each other. It failed because Arthur belonged to a violent world and Mary belonged to a world that could never fully accept him. When Mary asks for help with her brother Jamie, Arthur grumbles, resents the pull she still has on him, and goes anyway. Again, his pattern repeats. He acts irritated because the feeling is too vulnerable, then does the caring thing. The Jamie mission reveals one of Arthur's most important qualities. He understands lost young men because he was one. Jamie has fallen into the Shalonian cult, chasing certainty inside a ridiculous costume of spiritual salvation. Arthur can mock the cult, but he also recognizes the danger of a boy surrendering his mind to a charismatic leader. The irony is sharp, because Arthur himself has given much of his life to Dutch. He can see Jamie's delusion more easily than his own. But that is often how self-knowledge begins in Red Dead Redemption 2. Arthur recognizes a pattern outside himself before he can admit it is also inside him. Mary's presence also exposes Arthur's shame. Around her, he is not only an outlaw, he is a man who knows he disappointed someone who once hoped better for him. He wants to be seen as more than a killer, but he does not quite believe he deserves that mercy. When Mary thanks him, when she looks at him with old affection, Arthur becomes awkward. He wants the warmth and fears it at the same time. Love asks him to imagine a self beyond the gang, and that self feels almost impossible. He can ride across states for Dutch, but he cannot easily cross the distance between who he has been and who Mary needed him to become. Yet Arthur's debt collecting for Leopold Strauss becomes one of the darkest threads in his arc because it shows the cruelty he has normalized. Strauss is not a gunslinger. He is polite, controlled, and bloodless. His work depends on desperation. He lends to people who are already cornered, then sends Arthur to make sure suffering pays interest. Arthur dislikes it, or at least dislikes the ugliness of it, but he does it. He tells himself it is work. He tells himself the gang needs money. He tells himself these people made choices. At this point in the story, Arthur can feel discomfort without letting discomfort change him. The Thomas Downes encounter is the hinge that only reveals itself later. Arthur rides out to collect a debt from a sick farmer and beats him in front of his family. The scene is not stylized heroism. It is ugly, petty, and intimate. Downes is not a rival gang member trying to kill Arthur. He is poor, ill, and frightened, a man whose body is already failing. Arthur does not know that this moment will likely infect him with tuberculosis. He does not know that the consequences of his violence are entering his lungs. That is the terrible poetry of the scene. Arthur's old life literally gets inside him. At first, the Downes collection may feel like another cruel errand in a cruel world. Later, it becomes the moral infection Arthur cannot ignore. The disease is not a random punishment from the sky in a simple religious sense. It is more intimate than that. It comes from a moment when Arthur uses his strength against a weak man for money. The story does not pretend Arthur gets sick because he is the only guilty person. Many people in the gang have done terrible things, but Arthur's illness is tied to a specific act that makes his later awakening impossible to separate from his own violence. This is one of the reasons Arthur's redemption feels earned. He is not redeemed because he was secretly pure. He is redeemed because he finally sees the cost of what he has been. A weaker story might reveal that Arthur never really hurt innocent people, or that all his victims deserved it, or that he was only pretending to be bad. Red Dead Redemption 2 does something harsher and better. It lets Arthur be guilty. It lets him beat Thomas Downes. It lets him threaten debtors. It lets him kill. Then it asks what a guilty man can still do when he runs out of excuses. Arthur's friendship with Lenny shows another side of him before the darkness fully gathers. The night in Valentine, full of drinking, laughter, confusion, and shouting Lenny's name through the saloon, is comic relief. But it also matters emotionally. Arthur can be joyful. He can be ridiculous. He can lose the hard edge for a while and become just a drunk man laughing with a younger friend. Lenny is bright, educated, and full of promise, and Arthur seems to respect him deeply. That respect is part older brother affection and part quiet admiration. Arthur may not think of himself as intelligent in a refined way, but he knows intelligence when he sees it. The Valentine bank robbery and other early jobs show Arthur still operating inside the gang's practical optimism. There is danger, but there is also rhythm. Rob, ride, laugh, return. Trouble follows, but the camp still feels alive. Arthur's doubts are present, or yet they are not decisive. He questions Dutch's confidence sometimes, but he still believes enough to continue. This is the middle place in his arc, where the old identity still works because the consequences have not fully closed in. He is uneasy, but not transformed. Sean's return gives the gang a burst of youth and noise, and Arthur's reaction again reveals affection hidden under irritation. Sean is reckless, loud, and impossible, but the celebration around his rescue shows what the gang is trying to preserve. Music, firelight, drinking, dancing, the sense that hunted people can still create an evening of belonging. Arthur exists inside that warmth. He is not standing apart from it as a cynical outsider. He loves these people, and because he loves them, leaving the dream will later hurt more than simply escaping a bad job. The move to Clemens Point opens another stage of Arthur's arc, because the gang begins playing more dangerous games with people who do not understand them and forces they do not control. The Greys and Braithwaites represent old southern wealth rotting under manners, blood feuds, and family pride. Dutch sees opportunity. Hosea sees a con. Arthur rides through it with the usual skepticism, but he participates. The Rhodes chapter is important because it mirrors the gang's own problems in a different costume. Two families trapped in history, each convinced of its own grievance, each feeding the feud that keeps destroying them. Dutch's gang thinks it is smarter, freer, more modern. It is not as different as it wants to believe. Arthur's interactions with Beau Grey and Penelope Braithwaite bring a gentler irony into this chapter. Their romance is naive, but it is also sincere. Arthur becomes the rough outlaw, helping two young people reach for escape from inherited hatred. He can see the foolishness, but he also respects the desire to break away. That matters because Arthur himself is caught inside an inherited loyalty. He helps Beau and Penelope do what he cannot yet do. He becomes, briefly, the helper of another person's freedom while remaining chained to Dutch's plans. The kidnapping of Jack Marston is one of the moments when Arthur's protective instincts become impossible to miss. Jack is a child, and the gang's criminal games have placed him in danger. Arthur's anger is not abstract. He rides with the others to Braithwaite Manor, and the entire gang moves like a family wounded at its heart. The burning mansion, the march through the trees, the confrontation with Catherine Braithwaite, all of it feels operatic because it shows the gang at its most united. Arthur's love for Jack, Abigail, and even John is part of the force pushing forward. In that moment, the Van der Linde gang still has a moral centre. Harm the child, and everyone comes. Yet even that rescue carries warning signs. The gang's unity is real, but so is the chaos that caused the danger. Dutch's games with the families, the layered scams, the refusal to see when a con has become too unstable, all lead to Jack being taken. Arthur can feel the emotional rightness of saving Jack while not yet fully confronting the deeper problem. The family is brave when cleaning up disasters it helped create. That pattern will repeat until there are too many disasters and not enough family left to clean them. St. Denis changes Arthur's world by placing the gang in the future Dutch hates. The city is crowded, smoky, industrial, corrupt and alive with systems larger than any outlaw camp. Trolleys, factories, police, rich men, political machines, immigrant labour, high society parties and hidden poverty all press against the gang's old frontier mythology. Arthur is uncomfortable there. He's a man of open spaces forced into alleys, mansions and crowded streets. The city makes him feel outdated, and that feeling matters. Arthur's arc is not only moral, it is historical. He belongs to a way of life that is dying. Angelo Bronte becomes another test of Dutch's pride. Bronte is a criminal dressed in civilization's clothing, a man who uses manners, money and connections to dominate others. Arthur sees through him quickly. He may be rough, but he has a strong nose for false refinement. Dutch, however, becomes entangled in Bronte's world of insult and performance. The failed trolley station robbery and Bronte's humiliation of Dutch push Dutch closer to the edge. Arthur watches, questions and follows. He sees Dutch's anger growing, but he still has not fully separated his own judgment from Dutch's command. When Dutch drowns Bronte, Arthur is disturbed. The killing is personal, excessive and intimate. It is not just business. Dutch feeds Bronte to an alligator after losing control of the situation, and Arthur's reaction is one of the clearest early signs that his faith is cracking. He has seen Dutch kill before, but this feels different. It feels like revenge wearing the mask of necessity. Arthur does not become a rebel in that instant, but the old excuses become harder to keep in place. Dutch's violence is beginning to look less like leadership and more like ego. The St. Denis bank robbery is the disaster that breaks the gang's sense of possibility. Hosea dies, Lenny dies, John is captured. The plan collapses. The Pinkertons are waiting. The city swallows the gang's ambition and spits back grief. For Arthur, the loss of Hosea is enormous. Hosea was the moderating father, the one who could challenge Dutch without seeming like a traitor, the one who understood the old dream but also understood when to stop. With Hosea gone, Arthur loses not only a friend but one of the last emotional checks on Dutch's pride. Lenny's death hits differently. Hosea's death feels like the fall of the old guard. Lenny's death feels like the murder of the future. He was young, thoughtful, and capable of becoming something more than the life allowed him. Arthur has to run past his body in the chaos, barely able to process the loss. That inability to stop becomes part of the trauma. The gang's life is now moving too fast for proper grief. People die, and the survivors keep running. Arthur's heart is filling with unburied dead. Guarma strips the story down to heat, exhaustion, and disorientation. Arthur, Dutch, Micah, Bill, Javier, and the others are thrown onto an island far from the camp, far from the people they were supposed to protect, far from the dream of escape. Guarma is strange because it looks like a version of the tropical fantasy Dutch keeps promising, but it is not paradise. It is another place of exploitation, rebellion, and violence. The imagined island escape becomes an actual island nightmare. The story quietly mocks the idea that geography alone can save people from what they carry inside. On Guarma, Arthur sees Dutch kill Gloria, the elderly woman guiding them through the caves, after she demands more money. Dutch claims necessity, but Arthur's face says what his mouth cannot fully say yet. Something is wrong. The killing is small, ugly, and revealing. Dutch does not need a grand battlefield to show his decline. He shows it in a cave with a frightened woman who becomes inconvenient. Arthur's moral vision sharpens because the pattern is becoming undeniable. Dutch is no longer only risking the gang. He is becoming dangerous to anyone who stands between him and the next story he needs to tell himself. When Arthur returns from Guarma, his body finally forces him to stop pretending. The coughing, the weakness, the collapse in St. Denis and the doctor's diagnosis bring the hidden consequence of the downs beating into the open. Tuberculosis changes everything because it gives Arthur something the gang never gave him: a deadline. Before the diagnosis, Arthur can postpone moral reckoning. He can imagine that one day things may settle, one day Dutch may be right, one day the gang may escape, one day he may do better. After the diagnosis, one day becomes a lie. His life is no longer an open road. It is a narrowing path. The doctor tells him what is happening in plain terms, and Arthur walks out into the city changed. The streets sound different. The light feels different. The world has not stopped, but Arthur's place in it has shifted. He is still strong, still dangerous, still Arthur Morgan. Yet death has moved from an occupational risk to a certainty living inside his chest. That certainty does not instantly make him good. It makes him honest. He can no longer afford the comfort of endless delay. This is where Arthur's slow tragedy becomes one of the richest redemption stories in the whole Red Dead saga, because his illness does not magically purify him. It weakens him, frightens him, angers him, and exposes him. He still has habits of violence. He still belongs to a collapsing gang. He still makes choices inside a world that rarely offers clean options, but his attention changes. He begins noticing the people who still have a chance. John, Abigail, Jack, Tilly, Mary Beth, Sadie, Charles, Rains Fall, Captain Monroe, Edith Downs, Archie Downs. His own future shrinks, and because it shrinks, other people's futures become more visible. Arthur's encounters with Edith Downs and her son Archie are central to this awakening. He sees the family of the man he beat, sees what became of them, and cannot hide from the chain of consequences. Edith's hatred is justified. Archie is young and cornered. Arthur cannot undo Thomas Downes's death, cannot give them back their home, cannot make himself innocent. What he can do is help them leave the spiral he helped create. That is Arthur's redemption in its most honest form. It is not erasure. It is repair attempted too late, with no guarantee of forgiveness. Strauss becomes the symbol of the old Arthur's moral compromise. For years, Arthur collected debts because the gang needed money, and because he could treat Strauss's work as just another unpleasant chore. After the diagnosis, that excuse breaks. Arthur throws Strauss out of camp, not because Strauss is the only guilty man there, but because Strauss's work now represents a kind of cruelty Arthur can no longer stomach. The scene is not clean moral superiority. Arthur is also guilty. That is exactly why it matters. He's not saying he has never harmed the desperate. He is saying he refuses to keep doing it. This is the difference between innocence and redemption. Innocence would mean Arthur never needed to change. Redemption means he changes with blood still on his hands. He cannot become a saint by pretending the past was someone else's fault. He can only decide what kind of man he will be with the time left. That is why his final chapter has so much force. The story does not ask whether Arthur can balance the scales perfectly. It asks whether a dying man can stop adding weight to the wrong side. After the diagnosis, Arthur's relationship with Dutch becomes more painful, because Arthur can finally hear the emptiness beneath certain promises. Dutch keeps speaking of plans, money, loyalty, and the future. But Arthur is now living with a body that tells him the future is not guaranteed. This makes Dutch's vagueness feel crueler than before. When a healthy man hears about one more score, he can imagine surviving long enough to reach it. When a dying man hears the same words, he starts asking who benefits from the delay. Arthur begins to understand that Dutch's promises do not always point toward escape. Sometimes they only keep everyone obedient until the next disaster. The word loyalty changes meaning for Arthur. Earlier, Lusses, loyalty meant standing by the gang because the gang stood by him. It meant family, shared risk, and trust in Dutch's vision. Later, loyalty becomes a weapon used against honest concern. When Arthur questions Dutch, Dutch hears betrayal. When John doubts, Dutch sees weakness. When Abigail begs for her family, she becomes inconvenient. Arthur slowly realizes that true loyalty to the people he loves may require disloyalty to Dutch. That is one of the hardest emotional reversals in the story. Arthur has to choose between the leader who raised him and the family that leader is destroying. John Marston becomes the centre of that choice. Arthur's feelings toward John are tangled with resentment, affection, jealousy, disappointment, and protectiveness. Arthur resents that John left the gang for a year. He resents that Dutch seemed to forgive John more easily than Arthur might have. He resents John's immaturity, his distance from Abigail, his awkwardness as a father. But Arthur also sees that John has something worth saving. John has Abigail. John has Jack. John has a chance to step out of the life before it consumes him completely. Arthur may not be able to save himself, but he can push John toward the door. This makes Arthur's late bond with John feel like a strange form of fatherhood and brotherhood at once. Arthur is not John's father, but he becomes one of the forces trying to make John become a father. He scolds him, mocks him, protects him, and finally sacrifices for him. Arthur understands that Jack is the future in a way Dutch never really does. To Dutch, Jack can be part of the camp's dream, a child raised as a myth of freedom. To Arthur, by the end, Jack must be saved from the dream. The same campfire that once looked like family now looks like a trap if a child is forced to grow up in its shadow. Abigail's role in Arthur's awakening is often underrated. She sees the gang's danger with a clarity many of the men avoid. She's not blinded by the romance of outlaw brotherhood because she has Jack to protect. Her questions are practical. Where is John? Where is safety? What future does this life offer a child? Arthur respects her more as the story goes on because her fear is rooted in truth. She is not weak for wanting out. She is sane. When Arthur begins helping Abigail, he's also beginning to respect the kind of courage that does not look like a gunfight. Abigail's courage is persistence, motherhood, anger, and refusal. Sadie Adler's transformation also changes Arthur. At first, Sadie is a widow pulled out of devastation. She is raw grief with a voice. Over time, she becomes one of the gang's fiercest fighters, not because the gang gently heals her, but because the world leaves rage as one of the few tools she can carry. Arthur and Sadie develop a bond built on honesty. She does not need him to pretend the world is nicer than it is. He does not need her to be softer than she is. They ride together with an understanding that pain can either rot inside a person or become motion. Sadie becomes one of Arthur's late allies because she can see Dutch's collapse without needing to preserve the old myth. Charles Smith is another mirror for Arthur, but a quieter one. Charles is violent when he must be, yet he has a steadier moral compass. He chooses carefully, where he respects the land, animals, vulnerable people, and the dead. He is not innocent, but he is less intoxicated by performance than the others. Arthur's respect for Charles is deep because Charles represents a version of strength Arthur can admire without mistrust. Charles does not need speeches to be honourable. He does not need applause to be brave. Around Charles, Arthur seems more willing to speak plainly, perhaps because Charles is not trying to dominate the meaning of every moment. The missions involving Rainsfall and Eagle Flies bring Arthur's moral development into sharper focus. The Wapiti storyline places him near people being crushed by government pressure, military deception, and corporate hunger. Dutch sees their struggle and begins using it for distraction. Arthur sees the injustice too. Yeah, but he grows increasingly uncomfortable with Dutch's willingness to feed a young man's anger for the gang's benefit. Rainsfall asks for restraint because he knows revenge can destroy what little remains. Eagleflies wants action because patience has begun to look like surrender. Arthur stands between those energies while already knowing what it means to be used by a charismatic leader. Arthur's ride with Rainsfall is one of the calmest and most spiritually important parts of his arc. Rainsfall speaks with grief that has not become vanity. He has lost family, land, safety and dignity, yet he still tries to prevent more blood. Arthur, who has spent his life around men who turn injury into violence, meets a leader who carries pain without needing to make others worship it. That affects him. Rain's Fall does not redeem Arthur here, but he gives Arthur a living example of sorrow handled with grace. It is the opposite of Dutch's path. Dutch is wounded and expands his wound into everyone else's life. Rain's Fall is wounded and still tries to protect others from the wound spreading. Captain Monroe matters because he shows Arthur that decency can exist even inside institutions Arthur has learned to hate. Arthur has every reason to mistrust soldiers and government men. The army is helping crush the Wapiti. Yet Monroe is not simply a uniform. He's a man trying to do the right thing from within a corrupt machine. Arthur's willingness to help him shows growth in moral complexity. Earlier, Arthur often thinks in gang terms, us and them, family and enemy, outlaw and law. Later he becomes better at seeing individuals inside categories. A good man can wear a uniform. A bad man can sit beside your fire. This shift is central to Arthur's late arc. His world stops being divided by group loyalty and starts being divided by action. Dutch is family, but Dutch can be wrong. Micah is gang, but Micah is poison. Monroe is army, but Monroe can be honourable. Edith Downes hates Arthur, but she is right to hate him. Rain's Fall is not part of the gang, but Arthur owes him respect. John has disappointed Arthur, but John deserves help. Moral adulthood arrives when Arthur stops letting labels do his thinking for him. Micah Bell becomes the human shape of everything Arthur comes to reject. From the beginning, Micah is cruel, racist, violent, selfish, and delighted by chaos. Arthur dislikes him early, and that instinct never really changes. What changes is the danger Micah represents. At first, Micah seems like an unpleasant but useful gun. Later he becomes Dutch's favourite echo, the man encouraging Dutch's worst impulses while flattering his pride. Arthur's hatred of Micah is partly moral and partly personal. Micah is not only evil, he is replacing Arthur in Dutch's ear. He is the new son, the loyal snake, the man who tells Dutch that doubt is betrayal. The rivalry between Arthur and Micah is powerful because it is not just good versus bad. It is two possible versions of outlaw survival. Micah survives by shedding all responsibility. Arthur survives for years by carrying too much responsibility for the wrong people. Micah sees attachment as weakness. Arthur is saved in the end by attachment. Micah wants money, dominance, and proximity to power. Arthur wants, by the end, for someone else to get away clean enough to breathe. Their final conflict is not merely a fist fight. It is a battle between selfish survival and sacrificial love. Dutch's growing preference for Micah wounds Arthur in a deep, almost childlike place. Arthur may be a grown man, but Dutch is still the father who found him. To be doubted by Dutch, replaced by Micah, and treated as a problem after years of loyalty is devastating. Arthur's anger often covers grief. He is not only furious that Dutch is making bad choices, he is hurt that Dutch cannot see him anymore. He gave Dutch his youth, his strength, his violence, his obedience, and much of his conscience. In return, near the end, Dutch gives him suspicion. This is where Arthur's illness and Dutch's mistrust intersect. A dying Arthur has less ability to perform the old role. He is weaker, he coughs, he questions more. He cannot simply be the strong right hand forever. Dutch, who needs faith and usefulness, begins to experience Arthur's moral clarity as disloyalty. The tragedy is that Arthur becomes most worthy of Dutch's respect precisely when Dutch becomes least able to give it. The son grows up and the father cannot bear it. Molly O'Shea's death is another moment Arthur cannot fully control but clearly absorbs. Molly claims she betrayed the gang, desperate to be seen by Dutch, and Susan Grimshaw kills her. Later it turns out Molly did not give the Pinkertons information in the way everyone assumed. Her death becomes part of the gang's moral collapse, jealousy, neglect, panic, and the hunger for someone to blame. Arthur sees the camp becoming less capable of truth. People are no longer being understood. They are being sorted into loyalty and betrayal, useful and disposable. That atmosphere pushes him further away from Dutch's world. Susan Grimshaw herself represents the old camp order. She is harsh, loyal, disciplined, and often cruel in her own way, but she believes in the gang as a household that must be held together. When she eventually sides with Arthur against Micah, it matters because she is not a sentimental rebel. She is one of the camp's sternest guardians. Her recognition that Arthur is telling the truth shows how far Dutch has drifted. Even the old order can see the centre is poisoned. Javier and Bill are painful because they show how ordinary loyalty can become complicity. Javier is not Micah. Bill is not Micah. They have histories, fears, attachments, and reasons for clinging to Dutch. Javier especially has moments of warmth and idealism, but near the end both stand on Dutch's side as the truth cracks open. Arthur's arc hurts because not everyone he cares about can be pulled with him. Some people remain loyal to the collapsing father because losing him would mean losing themselves. Arthur has to accept that clarity does not automatically save a family. This is one of the loneliest parts of Arthur's redemption. Seeing the truth does not make the whole world come with you. It can make you more isolated. Arthur begins the story surrounded by people who mostly share a common reality. By the end, reality itself has split. Arthur, John, Abigail, Sadie, Charles and Susan can see one version. Dutch, Micah, Bill, Javier and others cling to another, and the camp becomes a place where people stand a few feet apart and live in different worlds. Beaver Hollow is the physical shape of that split. The camp is dark, damp, sickly and claustrophobic. It feels less like a refuge and more like a den. The laughter is thinner. The songs are fewer. People disappear, argue, whisper and watch one another. Arthur is dying in a dying camp, and the atmosphere externalizes his body. Horseshoe Overlook had open air and sunlight. Clemens Point had water and warmth. Shady Bell had decay hidden inside grandeur. Beaver Hollow has no disguise left. It is the gang's soul after the lies have rotted. Arthur's body in Beaver Hollow becomes part of the story's emotional language. He moves slower, his face changes, his eyes sink, his cough interrupts conversations. He looks like a man being hollowed out by the consequences of the life he lived. Yet at the same time, his moral presence grows stronger. This contrast is beautiful and cruel. As Arthur's physical power declines, his spiritual strength rises. The old Arthur could win fights and collect debts. The new Arthur can tell the truth, protect the vulnerable, and choose sacrifice. The body weakens while the soul finally stands upright. The moral path, whatever path is taken, frames Arthur's arc around choice rather than destiny. A cruel Arthur and a compassionate Arthur both face death, but the meaning of that death changes. The most powerful version of his arc is the one where he chooses kindness more often as the end approaches, not because kindness saves his life, it does not. Not because it erases the past, it cannot, but because it changes the direction of his final days. He stops moving deeper into harm and starts pushing what little strength he has toward mercy. Arthur's optional acts of help matter because they show redemption in ordinary gestures, not only grand sacrifice. He can help Charlotte Balfour learn to survive after her husband's death. He can aid strangers, return money, assist the Downs family, help widows, rescue people from danger, and show patience where old Arthur might have shown contempt. These moments are not side decorations, they are the texture of change. Redemption is not only one dramatic final choice on a mountain, it is a pattern of smaller choices made while no one important is watching. Charlotte Balfour is especially meaningful because she is another person stranded by loss. Arthur teaches her to hunt, and helps her survive, and treats her with a gentleness that does not ask for anything in return. Their connection is quiet, brief, and full of the life Arthur might have had if the world were different. At Charlotte's cabin, Arthur is not Dutch's enforcer, not Strauss's collector, not a gang member carrying out a plan. He is simply a dying man helping a grieving woman stand on her own. The softness of that storyline shows how much humanity was always inside him, waiting for a life that did not punish it. Brother Dawkins and Sister Calderon also help draw out Arthur's buried conscience. Their presence brings spiritual language into his arc without reducing it to easy religion. Sister Calderon's conversation with Arthur at the train station is one of the most important emotional scenes in the story. Arthur admits he is afraid. That confession is enormous. This is a man who has faced gunfire, wolves, lawmen and rival gangs, yet saying fear aloud is one of his bravest acts. He does not dress it up. He does not make a joke strong enough to hide it. He says the truth. Sister Calderon does not absolve him with empty comfort. She tells him to take a gamble that love exists and do a loving act. That advice reaches the core of Arthur's final transformation. He cannot prove that the universe will forgive him. He cannot know that his soul will be weighed kindly. He cannot restore the years, but he can act as if love matters. He can place his remaining life on that bet. Arthur's final chapter is that gamble becoming action. Mary Linton's final letter and the returned ring deepen the ache of what Arthur has lost. Mary offers a vision of escape earlier, but Arthur cannot take it. Later, it is too late. The ring becomes a symbol of a life that brushed against his hand and moved away. Arthur's relationship with Mary is not simply romantic regret. It is the part of him that knows he could have been different under different circumstances, but also knows that wanting difference is not the same as choosing it in time. By the end, Mary belongs to memory, and Arthur belongs to the road he has already walked. His old love for Mary and his growing loyalty to John's family are connected. Mary represents the life Arthur could not enter. John, Abigail and Jack represent the life someone still might reach. Arthur cannot go with Mary. He cannot become a husband in a clean house beyond the reach of the gang. But he can help John become the man Arthur failed to become. In that sense, Thus saving John is not only about John, it is Arthur sending forward the possibility he missed. This is why Arthur's redemption does not feel selfish. He is not trying to build a monument to his own goodness. He is trying to get people out. Tilly, Mary Beth, Pearson, Reverend Swanson, Uncle, Sadie, Charles, Abigail, Jack, John. Some leave through their own choices, some with help, some by luck, but Arthur's late energy is pointed toward escape. Dutch's energy is pointed toward keeping the dream alive under his command. Arthur's is pointed toward releasing people from it. That reversal tells the whole story. When Arthur says they are more ghosts than people, it is not just poetic despair, it is historical awareness. The world they belong to is vanishing. The outlaw age is ending. The gang is already half legend, half corpse, was moving through a landscape of telegraphs, railroads, banks, agents, paperwork, industrial money and state power. Dutch responds by performing defiance louder. Arthur responds by asking, who can still be saved from the wreck? One man fights the end by denying it. The other meets the end by choosing what it should mean. Arthur's arc is also about masculinity changing shape. Early Arthur's manhood is strength, endurance, violence, silence, and usefulness. He can take pain. He can give pain. He can ride, shoot, threaten, carry, and provide. Late Arthur does not lose all of that, but he discovers a harder kind of manhood, admitting fear, apologizing through action, protecting without possession, letting people go, and accepting that he cannot force the world to call him good. The final Arthur is not weaker because he is gentler. He is stronger because he no longer needs cruelty to prove he exists. His relationship with his horse carries part of this emotional shift. The horse is companion, tool, lifeline, and silent witness. Arthur cares for it, feeds it, brushes it, speaks to it, and depends on it across the map. In the final ride, the bond with the horse becomes heartbreakingly visible. When the horse falls, Arthur thanks it. That small line carries years of unspoken tenderness. He thanks an animal while men he served for decades fail to offer him the same grace. The moment works because Arthur's kindness has become simple and direct. No performance, no joke, just gratitude. The final ride back to camp is structured like a life passing before him. Memories echo, voices return, the music rises. The roads he has ridden become almost spiritual, where Arthur is not merely going to confront Dutch and Micah. He is riding through the meaning of everything he has been, the people he helped, harmed, loved, and failed, seem to gather around the edges of the journey. The ride feels slow, even when the horse is moving fast because Arthur's life has narrowed to one last obligation. Get John and his family out, and tell the truth before the lie buries everyone. The confrontation at camp is one of the most devastating scenes, because Arthur finally speaks the truth in a place built on Dutch's words. He tells them Micah is the rat. He tells them what is happening. He stands there sick, exhausted, and nearly alone, trying to force reality into a family that has been living on denial. The reaction around him shows the gang's final shape. Susan stands with him. John arrives wounded and betrayed. Micah snarls and deflects. Dutch freezes between the son who tells painful truth and the parasite who offers flattering lies. Bill and Javier hover on the wrong side of history, not because they are empty men, but because fear and habit still hold them there. Arthur does not win that argument in the simple sense. Dutch does not embrace him. The gang does not suddenly wake from the spell. But Arthur wins something deeper by refusing to lie. For most of his life, he protected Dutch's image. In that moment, he protects reality instead. He is no longer the man who makes Dutch's plans possible. He is the man standing in the ruins saying the plan was poison. That is an enormous transformation for someone whose identity was built around loyalty. The choice to help John instead of going back for the money defines Arthur's arc at its clearest. And money has driven so much of the gang's decline. Dutch keeps saying they need more. Strauss's debts feed the camp. Scores become excuses. The Blackwater money hangs over the story like a lost treasure and a curse. By the end, Arthur can choose between chasing money and saving a person. The honourable path is not subtle. It is the final rejection of the lie that money will redeem the gang. Arthur chooses life over loot, future over fantasy, love over proof. As Arthur and John flee through the caves and cliffs, the story returns to the beginning in reverse. Earlier, Arthur went into the snow to bring John back because Dutch needed him. At the end, Arthur helps John leave because Dutch has become the danger. The same bond that once served the gang now breaks the gang's hold. Arthur sends John forward, pushing him toward Abigail and Jack, and thus a stir toward the possibility of a ranch, toward all the messy failures and hopes that will become John's own story. Arthur knows John is flawed. That is exactly why the sacrifice matters. Redemption is not spent only on the worthy in some perfect sense. It is spent on the living. When Arthur gives John his hat, he is passing more than clothing. The hat carries Arthur's identity, his silhouette, his place in the world. It has been with him through robberies, rides, storms, jokes, grief, and blood. Giving it to John is a symbolic inheritance, but not a command to become Arthur. It is a blessing to survive him. The hat says, "Take what was good, leave what killed me, keep moving." It is one of the simplest and most powerful gestures in the story because Arthur, who has often struggled to speak tenderness, gives John a piece of himself instead. As the fight with Micah on the mountain is not glamorous, Arthur is sick, battered, coughing, and almost spent. Micah is vicious, opportunistic, and physically stronger in that moment because he has not been eaten from the inside by disease. The fight feels unfair, which is exactly why it works. Arthur's final battle is not a clean duel between equal legends. It is a dying man using the last of his strength to hold back the human embodiment of everything that corrupted the gang. Every punch carries exhaustion. Every breath costs him. He is no longer fighting to win a life for himself. He is fighting to buy time. Dutch arriving at the end turns the scene into the final family wound. Arthur looks to Dutch not as a stranger, but as the father who should have known better. Micah accuses, Arthur pleads, and Dutch stands between the truth and the lie one last time. In the honourable ending, Arthur tells Dutch that he gave him all he had. That line contains a whole life. It is not only about money or work. Arthur gave Dutch loyalty, youth, violence, trust, love, and the best years of his body. He gave everything a son could give to a father who kept asking for more. At the end, there is nothing left to give except the truth. Dutch walking away is one of the cruelest answers he could offer. He does not save Arthur. He does not kill Micah there. He does not admit enough. He simply leaves. For Arthur, that silence may be the final confirmation that the Dutch he loved is gone, or perhaps was never as complete as Arthur needed him to be. For Dutch, the silence is cowardice, shame, confusion, and self-preservation all mixed together. He cannot fully side with Micah after Arthur's words, but he cannot kneel beside Arthur and confess either. So he abandons the moment, as he has abandoned so many truths. Arthur's death facing the sunrise gives his arc its emotional release. The sun does not erase what he did. It does not make the world fair. It does not bring back Thomas Downs, Hosea, Lenny, Sean, Kieran, Molly, Susan, Eagleflies, or the others. But it gives Arthur a final image of peace after a life of motion. He dies alone, yet not empty. John has escaped. Abigail and Jack still have a chance. Some of the people Arthur helped will carry on. He could not save the gang, but he saved something from it. That is enough for the story to let him breathe out under the morning light. The low-honor version of Arthur's death changes the emotional meaning without erasing the structure of his tragedy. A crueler Arthur dies more violently, with less peace, because the final days reflect the choices made along the road. That flexibility matters because Arthur is both a written character and a lived role. Yet the strongest emotional version is the one where he chooses mercy, because the entire story seems built around the possibility that a man shaped by brutality can still turn toward grace before the end. The sunrise ending feels like the completion of a moral movement that began long before Arthur admitted it. The buck and wolf imagery gives that moral movement a visual language. The buck appears with high honor as a symbol of gentleness, watchfulness, and life moving quietly through the world. The wolf appears with low honor as a lonelier, more predatory sign. These images do not reduce Arthur to a simple animal symbol. They give shape to the direction of his soul. Is he becoming more peaceful, more aware, more connected to life beyond himself? Or is he becoming more isolated and hungry? The visions are less about judgment from above, and more about the path Arthur has been walking inside himself. Arthur's arc continues after his death because the epilogue is haunted by him. John does not simply inherit a hat, he inherits a debt. He survives because Arthur chose him, and survival asks something of him. The slow labour of building Beecher's hope, learning to ranch, trying to be a husband and father, and stepping into ordinary life is partly John's own growth, but Arthur's shadow stands behind it. And every fence post and board carries the question of whether Arthur's sacrifice can become a real home. The answer is complicated because Red Dead Redemption reminds us that history will still come for John. But for a while, the sacrifice holds. Arthur's journal passing to John is one of the most beautiful continuations of his inner life. John reads the pages, adds his own rougher drawings and notes, and carries Arthur's memory forward in a private way. The journal was where Arthur could be most honest with himself. For John to hold it is to receive not only records of events but the evidence of Arthur's soul. It tells John that Arthur was more thoughtful, more observant, and more wounded than his rough voice always revealed. It also lets Arthur's perspective survive beyond his body, which matters in a story so full of men disappearing into legend. At Beecher's Hope, Arthur's sacrifice becomes domestic. That sounds small, but it is profound. The reward for all the violence and tragedy is not a throne, not a fortune, not revenge as a final answer. It is a house, a family table, a barn, a marriage, a child with a future, and work that does not require robbing anyone. The ordinariness is the point. Arthur gives John the chance to become boring in the best possible way. After a life of gun smoke and speeches, boring becomes holy. Yet the epilogue also shows the limits of redemption by sacrifice. Arthur can save John from one death, one mountain, one collapsing gang, but he cannot save John from every consequence of the life they lived. John still goes after Micah. John still steps into violence. John still exposes himself. The government still finds him later. This does not make Arthur's sacrifice meaningless. It makes it human. Good acts do not control the entire future. They only open doors. Whether the living walk through them cleanly is another question. When John finds Micah years later and Dutch appears again, Arthur's absence is almost a character in the scene. The snow returns, the past gathers. Micah is older but still poisonous. Dutch is older but still unreadable. John stands there wearing Arthur's hat, carrying Arthur's memory into a confrontation Arthur did not live to finish. Dutch shooting Micah can feel like delayed recognition, but it is not enough to redeem Dutch. It is too late for Arthur, too late for the gang, too late for the dead. Still, the act suggests Arthur's final words lodge somewhere inside Dutch, like a bullet that took years to reach the heart. Arthur's slow tragedy also changes the way the entire Van der Linde gang is remembered. Without Arthur, the gang could be seen mainly as Dutch's tragedy or John's backstory. With Arthur at the centre, the gang becomes a moral crucible. Every relationship reveals a different part of him. Dutch reveals the loyal son. Hosea reveals the better student. John reveals the protective brother. Abigail reveals the man learning to respect practical love. Jack reveals tenderness. Mary reveals regret. Sadie reveals comradeship after pain. Charles reveals quiet honour. Micah reveals disgust and rivalry. Strauss reveals complicity. Downes reveals guilt. Rainsfall reveals humility. Sister Calderon reveals fear and hope. That is why Arthur feels so complete. He is not defined by one relationship. He is a different shade of himself with each person, as real people are. Around Dutch, he is guarded and devoted. Around Hosea, he is more boyish, more willing to be corrected. Around John, he is sharp-tongued and caring. Around Jack, he softens almost despite himself. Around Mary, he becomes ashamed and tender. Around Sadie, he becomes honest and practical. Around Charles, he becomes respectful. Around Micah, he becomes openly hostile because Micah draws out Arthur's moral instinct before Arthur fully understands it. His humour is a major part of why his arc works. Arthur is often funny in a dry, weary, cutting way. He can reduce danger to a muttered complaint, answer absurdity with sarcasm, and puncture romantic speeches with plain observation. The humour keeps him from becoming a solemn symbol too early. It also shows intelligence. Arthur may call himself a dumb man, and others may treat him as the gang's heavy hand, but his humour reveals quick perception. He sees through people. He reads rooms. He knows when something is foolish. His tragedy is not that he lacks insight. It is that he spends too long refusing to apply it where it hurts most. Arthur's low opinion of himself is another key part of his psychology. He often speaks as if he is stupid, ugly, doomed, or beyond saving. Some of that is defensive. If he insults himself first, others have less power to wound him. Some of it is learned. A boy raised into violence may not develop a gentle sense of his own worth. Some of it is guilt. Arthur knows what he has done, but the story keeps showing that his self-judgment is incomplete. He is not innocent, but he is not worthless. His arc is partly the painful discovery that being guilty does not free him from the responsibility to do good. That idea is easy to miss, but it is central. Sometimes people use guilt as an excuse to keep falling. If I am already bad, why try? If I am already damned, why change? Arthur flirts with that despair, especially after the diagnosis. But he does not stay there. He gradually accepts a harder truth. Being bad in the past does not make goodness pointless in the present. The fact that he cannot become innocent makes his final choices more meaningful, not less. He does not act because goodness will make him clean. He acts because people still need help. Arthur's art reveals the same hidden tenderness as his humour and his journal. His sketches are careful. He notices the curve of an animal, the shape of a building, the face of a stranger, the outline of a plant. A man completely dead inside would not draw the world with such attention. Drawing is a form of love, even when the artist does not call it that. Arthur's sketches suggest that beneath the outlaw training there is a person who wants to look closely rather than simply take. That capacity for attention becomes part of his redemption. He learns to see people more clearly before he dies. His treatment of animals, especially horses, also shows the gap between his violence and his tenderness. Arthur can be ruthless with men in a fight, yet patient with a horse, careful with a hunt, and admiring of the natural world. He is comfortable in wilderness because it does not demand that he perform civilization's lies. The open world around him gives his soul space that camp politics often deny. Riding through mountains, plains, forests, and swamps, Arthur becomes a man in relation to something larger than Dutch's voice. Nature is not morally simple, but it is honest. It does not flatter him, betray him, or ask for faith. This is why the landscape matters so much to Arthur's arc. The movement from snowy mountains to green overlooks, from southern plantations to St. Denis streets, from tropical Guarma to the rot of Beaver Hollow, is not just scenery, it is emotional geography. Each place shows a stage of the gang's illusion. Coulter is survival, Horseshoe is false peace, Clemens Point is dangerous play, Shady Bell is decay dressed as shelter, St. Denis is the future closing in, Guarma is the fantasy turned nightmare, Beaver Hollow is the truth with no perfume left. Arthur rides through all of it, becoming more honest as the world becomes harsher. Arthur's connection to the past is complicated by the son he lost, Isaac. The story only gives pieces of that wound, but those pieces explain a great deal. Arthur had a child with a woman named Eliza, and he visited them when he could. They were killed for a small amount of money. That loss hardened him. It also left him with a buried grief around fatherhood, poverty, and the cost of violence. When he looks at Jack, when he pushes John toward Abigail, when he helps families in trouble, Isaac's ghost is never far away. Arthur knows what it means for a child to be swallowed by the world's cruelty. The loss of Isaac also explains why Arthur may not believe he deserves a family of his own. He had one, in a fragile way, and could not protect it. After that, the gang becomes the only family he lets himself serve, but it is a family built on danger. His grief turns into usefulness. He cannot save his own child, so he becomes the man who rides out for everyone else. By the end, saving Jack is not only about loyalty to John, it is Arthur refusing to let another boy's life be crushed by outlaw pride if he can help it. Arthur's relationship with fatherhood is therefore layered. Dutch is his father figure, Hosea is another. Arthur loses a son. Arthur becomes a kind of rough uncle to Jack. Arthur pushes John to become a better father. He dies like a son, abandoned by Dutch while acting like a father to John's future. The story folds these roles together until Arthur becomes both the wounded child and the protective adult. His redemption is partly the moment he stops waiting for Dutch to be the father he needs and becomes the protector someone else needs instead. Mary's father, Mr. Gillis, adds another sharp edge to Arthur's shame. He sees Arthur as unsuitable, criminal, and beneath Mary. The painful thing is that Arthur partly agrees. He despises the old man's cruelty and hypocrisy, but he cannot fully dismiss the judgment. Arthur's class position, criminal life, and self-loathing all meet in that relationship. He knows polite society often uses morality to hide greed and cowardice, yet he also knows his own hands are bloody. He stands between two worlds that both condemn him in different ways. This tension makes Arthur more than a simple outlaw romantic. He is not merely a free man crushed by civilization. He is also a man who has helped create suffering. The law is corrupt, but Arthur is not innocent. Rich men are cruel, but Arthur has been cruel to the poor. Dutch's critique of society has truth, but that truth does not absolve the gang. Arthur's greatness as a character comes from holding all of this at once. He can be right about the world and wrong in his life. He can be a victim of history and an agent of harm. He can be loved and guilty. The tuberculosis diagnosis forces him to stop using the gang's grand politics to avoid personal responsibility. Dutch can talk about systems, banks, civilization, and freedom forever. Arthur begins asking smaller, sharper questions. Did I help that person? Did I hurt that family? Can John get out? Can Abigail and Jack survive? Can I still do one decent thing? The scale shrinks from revolution to responsibility. That shrinking is not a loss of depth. It is the beginning of truth. The closer Arthur gets to death, the less patience he has for speeches that turn living people into scenery. The more Arthur changes, the more he notices Dutch's language as a trap. In the early chapters, Dutch's speeches can still feel warm because they are connected to visible care. He speaks, and people eat. He speaks, and the camp survives the snow. He speaks, and the frightened feel steadier. But later, the words detach from reality. Faith becomes a demand without evidence. Loyalty becomes silence. Doubt becomes treason. Arthur begins to hear the difference between hope and performance. Hope gives people strength to act. Performance asks people to applaud while the floor burns. And Arthur's tragedy is that he understands Dutch too late, but not too late to matter. If he had seen Dutch clearly years earlier, perhaps he could have left, taken others, or changed the shape of his life. But stories of redemption are often late by nature. They begin when easy exits are gone. Arthur's late understanding still matters because it changes the final outcome for John, Abigail, and Jack. The timing is painful, but it is not meaningless. A truth learned near death can still save the living. The role of choice in Arthur's arc is subtle, because he lives inside so many forces he did not choose. He did not choose to lose his parents as a boy. He did not choose the age he was born into, an age where poor boys could be swallowed by gangs, labour, prison, or hunger. He did not choose to be taken in by Dutch and Hosea instead of some gentler household. He did not choose the spread of industrial capitalism, the closing frontier, or the rise of state power. But he does choose, again and again, how to respond once he can see more clearly. The story never pretends choice is unlimited. It only insists that limited choice still matters. This makes Arthur feel human rather than mythical. He's not free in the abstract sense Dutch loves to preach. He is constrained by poverty, history, family, guilt, illness, and violence. But within those constraints, he finds moments of moral freedom. He can tell Edith Downes to leave and give her help. He can throw Strauss out. He can help rains fall. He can rescue Abigail. He can give John his hat. He can die telling the truth. Yea, none of these choices abolish the world that made him. They are small flames in a storm, but the game treats them as precious because people live by such flames. Arthur's relationship with religion is interesting because he is not pious in any simple way. He jokes, doubts, sins, and carries no clean doctrine. Yet as death approaches, spiritual questions rise around him, not because he suddenly becomes a different man, but because death strips away the noise. He wonders whether he's afraid, whether he has done any good, whether helping people now means anything after so much harm. Sister Calderon meets him there with compassion rather than judgment. She does not ask him to recite a perfect belief. She asks him to act from love. That is why the scene works even for someone who does not share her faith. It is about grace as motion, and the word redemption in Arthur's story does not mean he becomes pure. It means he turns around. That is the older, harder sense of it. A change in direction, a refusal to keep walking deeper into the same darkness. Arthur's past is not washed away. His victims remain victims. The dead remain dead. The Downes family still suffered. But Arthur stops defending the path that led him there. He begins walking another way, even though that way is short. The shortness makes it more urgent. He cannot repair everything, so he repairs what he can reach. One of the most moving things about Arthur is that he does not become sentimental in a false way. He remains Arthur. He still mutters, he still insults, he still gets tired of fools, he still has a rough voice and a dry edge. His change does not erase his personality. It reveals the heart that was always under it. This is why the arc feels believable. People do not usually transform by becoming unrecognizable overnight. They transform when the better parts of them gain authority over the worse parts. Arthur dies sounding like himself, only more honest. His late conversations with John carry that same rough honesty. Arthur does not sit John down and deliver polished wisdom. He tells him to run, to not look back, to be loyal to what matters. He cuts through John's confusion with urgency because there is no time left for delicate phrasing. The love is in the command. Arthur has spent years mocking John for being foolish, absent, and weak. At the end, he trusts John with the future. That trust is both gift and burden. John must become worthy of a sacrifice he never asked Arthur to make. Arthur's relationship with Jack shows his tenderness in small ways before it becomes part of the final sacrifice. He takes Jack fishing. He speaks to him more gently than he speaks to most adults. He gives him attention without needing anything from him. Jack represents innocence, but not in a decorative way. He's a child absorbing the atmosphere of a dangerous family. Arthur knows enough to understand that children remember more than adults think. The fishing trip is peaceful on the surface, but even there the Pinkertons intrude, reminding everyone that violence can reach into the gentlest moments. That fishing trip also shows Arthur as a man capable of simple goodness long before he names it as redemption. He is patient with Jack. He listens. He helps. He jokes softly. The interruption by Milton and Ross makes the contrast brutal. Arthur can create a small pocket of safety for a child, but the gang's life will not allow that safety to last. The world comes riding up on horseback dressed as law, carrying threats. The moment foreshadows the entire arc. Arthur can give Jack moments of care, but eventually he must help remove Jack from the life itself. Arthur and Abigail often share an unspoken understanding because both see John's flaws and care about him anyway. Abigail's frustration with John is practical, not abstract. She needs him present. Arthur's frustration is older brother judgment mixed with fear that John will waste the chance Arthur no longer has. Together they form a kind of pressure around John, pushing him toward responsibility. It is messy, sometimes harsh, and not always fair, but it comes from the recognition that fatherhood is not a feeling. It is a series of choices. Arthur's ability to change is tied to his ability to grieve properly at last. For much of the story, grief is interrupted. Davy dies, Jenny is gone, Mac is gone, Sean dies, Kieran dies, Hosea dies, Lenny dies, Molly dies, Eagle Flies dies, Susan dies. The gang keeps moving, and each death becomes another reason to rob, run, or blame. Arthur's illness forces a different kind of grief because he cannot outrun it. He has to sit with the dead, including the parts of himself already gone. His redemption begins when grief stops being fuel for violence and becomes understanding. Sean's death in Rhodes is an early rupture because it happens so suddenly. One moment there is banter, the next, blood. Arthur has lived with danger for years, but sudden loss still shocks him. Sean's death strips away the playful confidence of the Rhodes con. It proves the gang is not controlling the situation. The world can answer their cleverness with a bullet from a balcony. Arthur absorbs this, but Dutch turns each loss into another step in the argument for continuing. This difference grows more important as the bodies pile up. Kieran's death is another moral wound. Kieran begins as an enemy, an O'Driscoll, someone the gang distrusts and abuses. Over time he becomes awkwardly attached to the camp, especially after saving Arthur's life. His murder and mutilation by the O'Driscolls show the cruelty of the feud in its purest form. Arthur's reaction is not just anger. There is horror there, because Kieran's life had begun to prove that old labels can change. An enemy can become a person. The feud destroys that possibility. This connects to Arthur's later growth because he becomes increasingly able to see people outside the categories handed to him. Kieran is not merely an O'Driscoll. Monroe is not merely army. Rainsfall is not merely a useful ally. Edith Downs is not merely a debtor's widow. John is not merely a fool who left. Arthur's moral world becomes more specific. Specificity is the enemy of cruelty. It is easier to hurt a category than a person. Arthur's awakening is partly the painful return of personhood to the people around him. Hosea's death deserves its own weight in Arthur's arc. Hosea knew Dutch longer than almost anyone. He could tease him, question him, and soften him. For Arthur, Hosea carried a kind of parental steadiness that Dutch lacked. Hosea was not innocent, but he was more aware of limits. When Milton kills him outside the St. Denis Bank, the gang loses a man who might still have slowed Dutch's descent. Arthur loses a father who did not need worship. After Hosea, Dutch's voice fills more space, and Micah's whisper gets closer to his ear. Arthur's grief for Hosea is quieter than the loss deserves because there is no time. The bank robbery explodes. Lenny dies. The escape begins. Guama follows. The lack of proper mourning becomes part of the gang's sickness. A family that cannot stop to grieve becomes a machine that converts death into motion. Arthur's illness later forces him to do what the gang never does: stop and measure the meaning of a life. Lenny's death cuts into Arthur's sense of responsibility. Lenny was younger, and Arthur often seemed to enjoy his company because Lenny challenged the dullness around him. He was educated, observant, and brave. Arthur's drunken night with him is one of the few scenes where Arthur seems almost carefree. Losing Lenny is losing one of the gang's brightest possible futures. It is not just another gun gone from the roster. It is proof that Dutch's dream consumes the young as readily as the old. Sadie's vengeance against the O'Driscolls gives Arthur another mirror of grief. He understands her rage, but he also sees the cost. Sadie becomes powerful through violence, yet the violence cannot return her husband. Arthur does not judge her in a simplistic way because he knows revenge from the inside. He has lived in a gang built partly on old scores, but by the end, Arthur's path diverges from revenge. He is not trying to settle every account. He is trying to save what can still live. This difference between revenge and rescue is crucial. Dutch increasingly frames violence as necessary revenge against enemies, traitors, and systems. Micah frames violence as appetite. Sadie often frames it as grief. Arthur, near the end, frames violence as a last tool for protection or escape. He still kills. The world still forces guns into his hands. But the moral direction changes. Violence no longer feels like identity. It becomes something he wants to spend carefully, because there is so little of himself left. Arthur's guilt over the Downs family also makes him more sensitive to economic cruelty. Earlier, poverty can be background noise. Debtors, farmers, workers, widows, servants, people pushed around by richer men. Later, these lives become harder for him to ignore. He begins to understand that the gang's robberies and Strauss's loans do not only strike banks and rich fools, they ripple into ordinary people. Dutch can keep his language focused on big enemies, but Arthur has seen enough kitchens, sickbeds, and frightened faces to know the truth is messier. The tragedy is that Arthur's moral clarity arrives while Dutch's moral language becomes more abstract. Dutch speaks of liberty, civilization, betrayal, and destiny. Arthur speaks of getting people out, helping a widow, saving a boy, paying a debt, telling John to run. Abstraction lets Dutch avoid the faces. Specificity forces Arthur to see them. The story seems to trust Arthur more as his goals become smaller, because smaller goals are harder to hide behind. You either helped that person, or you did not. Arthur's conversations with Reverend Swanson add another quiet thread. Swanson begins as a broken man, addicted and often useless, someone Arthur saves from danger with exasperated care. Yet Swanson can leave and find some kind of better path, depending on how the story unfolds. His departure is a sign that escape is possible for some people before the final collapse. Arthur's attitude toward him is rough, but beneath it is again that pattern. Irritation on the surface, care underneath. He may mock Swanson, but he still pulls him from the tracks. Tilly and Mary Beth represent another part of what Arthur wants to preserve. They are young women who have survived danger and exploitation, and the gang has given them shelter of a kind. Arthur treats them with a protective older brother warmth that rarely becomes sentimental. As the camp worsens, helping people like Tilly and Mary Beth get out becomes part of the moral evacuation Arthur is trying to accomplish. The gang once saved lost people by bringing them in. By the end, salvation means helping them leave. Pearson's later life as a shopkeeper, Mary Beth's life as a writer, Tilly's marriage, and Swanson's escape all show that the Van der Linde gang was not the only possible identity for its members. Arthur does not live to see every outcome, but his late understanding points toward that truth. Dutch made the gang feel like the only family, the only refuge, the only world. But some people do survive outside it. That fact quietly defeats Dutch's mythology. The family mattered, but it was not a prison everyone had to die inside. Arthur's own inability to leave earlier is therefore not proof that leaving was impossible. It is proof that emotional captivity can feel like love. Dutch did love Arthur in some way, and Arthur loved Dutch. That love made the cage harder to see. Arthur's arc is not about discovering that the gang never meant anything. It is about discovering that something can mean a great deal and still need to end. This is one of the story's most adult truths. Not every cherished thing can be saved. Some must be released before they devour the people inside them. Arthur's need for recognition from Dutch is one of the most painful parts of his psychology, because it does not vanish when Arthur becomes wiser. Understanding a parent's failure does not instantly cure the child inside the adult. Arthur can know Dutch is wrong and still want Dutch to admit he was right. He can see the manipulation and still ache for the old warmth. This is why the story lands so deeply. Growth does not mean Arthur stops loving the people who damaged him. Growth means he stops obeying that love when it demands the destruction of others. The same emotional realism appears in Arthur's anger. He is not peaceful in a spotless way at the end. He is furious, sick, frightened, grieving, and disgusted. Redemption does not make him serene every moment. It gives his anger a better purpose. Earlier, anger often served gang business, pride, or survival. Later, anger serves protection and truth. When Arthur confronts Micah, when he challenges Dutch, when he pushes John to run, the anger is still there, but it is no longer empty heat. It is the last fire in a man trying to burn a path out for someone else. Arthur's voice carries the whole arc. Early on, it is low, amused, and dangerous, with a heaviness that suggests a man used to being obeyed when threats become necessary. Later, the same voice cracks, coughs, softens, and reveals fear. The change is not only in what he says, but in how much effort speech begins to cost him. Breath becomes precious. Every conversation after the diagnosis has death behind it. The body turns language into labour, and that makes his honest words feel earned. When he says he is afraid, it feels like the sentence had to fight its way out of his chest. His face changes too. The strong, weathered outlaw becomes gaunter, paler, and more haunted. The eyes remain sharp, but the flesh around them tells the truth. This matters because Arthur's body becomes evidence against the life he lived. The old outlaw myth depends on endless endurance. Ride forever, fight forever, drink forever, rob forever, recover forever. Tuberculosis destroys that myth. Arthur's body says there is no forever. There is only consequence. The weakening body does what no moral lecture could do. It makes denial physically impossible. Arthur's story can also be read as a movement from being an instrument to being a person. For much of his life, he is used by the gang, even by people who love him. Dutch uses his strength. Strauss uses his intimidation. The camp uses his labour. John sometimes relies on his protection. The group depends on him so completely that his own interior life can disappear behind usefulness. The diagnosis breaks the instrument. A broken tool is no longer valued only for work, and in that painful space, Arthur becomes more visibly human. He starts acting from choice rather than assignment. This is why the missions where Arthur helps without clear gang benefit feel so important. Helping Charlotte does not enrich Dutch. Helping Edith Downs does not bring a score. Helping Rains Fall does not secure paradise. Helping Sister Calderon and Brother Dawkins does not strengthen the camp. These acts belong to Arthur more fully than many of the robberies do. They are not perfect, and some still involve danger, but they come from a self that is separating from the gang's appetite. Arthur is no longer only the hand of Dutch van der Linde. He is Arthur Morgan making his own final account. The idea of an account is important because so much of the story is about debts. Strauss keeps literal debts. Dutch keeps emotional debts. Arthur feels moral debts. John inherits a debt of sacrifice. The gang owes loyalty, money, blood and truth, but none of the books balance cleanly. Arthur's late actions are not about paying everything back exactly. Some debts cannot be repaid because the people who are owed are dead or ruined. Instead, he changes the direction of what he owes. He stops collecting from the desperate and begins giving to those who might still escape. Arthur's relationship with money becomes almost contemptuous by the end. He understands its necessity, because poverty kills and the gang needs resources, but he no longer believes money can answer the deeper sickness. Dutch's obsession with one more score becomes absurd when set beside Arthur's mortality. What amount of cash buys back Hosea? What hidden stash cures tuberculosis? What bank job returns Jack's childhood to safety? What pile of coins makes Dutch honest? Arthur's final choice to help John rather than return for the money rejects the false god that has haunted the gang since Blackwater. Even the Blackwater money functions like a myth more than a practical fund. It is always somewhere behind them, lost and waiting, a symbol of the life they think they could have if only they reached it. But the money is not the real barrier. The real barrier is that Dutch cannot stop being Dutch, Micah cannot stop being Micah, and the gang cannot stop generating disaster long enough to become peaceful. Arthur sees this near the end. The problem is no longer simply that they do not have enough money. The problem is that money has become the excuse for refusing to face who they are. The Arthur's illness also reveals the difference between courage and denial. Before the diagnosis, he has physical courage in abundance. He will ride into gunfire, face predators, fight lawmen, and stand beside the gang in impossible odds. After the diagnosis, he needs another courage. The courage to know he is dying and still do good. Many people can be brave when they believe survival is possible. Arthur becomes brave when survival is no longer the reward. That is a deeper, lonelier bravery, because it cannot be fed by dreams of personal victory. The way Arthur responds to fear is central to his dignity. He does not conquer fear by pretending it is gone. He admits it, then acts. That is more mature than the old outlaw posture. Dutch often treats fear as something to be buried under faith. Micah treats fear as weakness to exploit. Arthur learns to carry fear honestly. When he says he's afraid, the confession does not make him smaller, it makes him more complete. A man who can name fear and still choose love has reached a kind of strength Dutch never truly understands. Arthur's arc also has a class dimension. He is poor, rough, and marked by a world that rarely gives men like him clean options. He has every reason to distrust the rich and respectable, yet the story refuses to let class anger become automatic innocence. Arthur is shaped by injustice, but he also enacts injustice. He is exploited by Dutch's dream and also exploits others for the gang. This complexity keeps the character from becoming propaganda. He is not a symbol of pure oppressed virtue. He is a damaged man in a damaged world, learning too late that suffering does not give him permission to pass suffering along. The way Arthur treats strangers can shift dramatically depending on the path taken, and that flexibility deepens the arc rather than weakening it. He can be cruel, generous, impatient, curious, threatening, or kind. The best version of him is not unbelievable because the worst version is always nearby. His goodness matters because it is chosen against habits that would make cruelty easier. When he helps someone on the road, he is not acting as a naturally harmless man. He is choosing not to be ruled by the hardness that life carved into him. This makes his kindness feel practical, other than decorative. Arthur does not float through the world offering empty sweetness. He fixes problems. He teaches, rides, carries, pays, protects, warns, and sometimes simply listens. His love language is action because action is what he trusts. Words have been corrupted by Dutch for too long. Arthur's final self is built less from speeches than from deeds. He does not need to explain goodness perfectly. He needs to do it before time runs out. The contrast with Dutch could not be clearer. Dutch speaks beautifully about love and freedom, while increasingly failing to practice either. Arthur speaks awkwardly, often harshly, but his late actions become more loving and freeing. Dutch's words rise while his deeds sink. Arthur's words become simpler while his deeds rise. That crossing pattern is the heart of the story. The father becomes all performance. The son becomes all proof. Arthur's bond with Hosea continues to matter after Hosea's death, because Hosea represents the version of outlaw wisdom Arthur might have followed if the gang had taken another path. Hosea could deceive people, but he understood the need to walk away. He was old enough to know that pride kills. Arthur inherits some of that late wisdom, but only after Hosea is gone. It is as if Hosea's voice moves into Arthur's conscience, becoming louder in absence than it could be in life. When Arthur questions Dutch, some part of Hosea seems to be speaking through the doubt. The memory of Hosea also complicates Arthur's view of the gang. If Dutch were the only father, leaving might mean rejecting everything. But Hosea's influence lets Arthur understand that the gang contained better principles than Dutch's pride. Care, humour, restraint, cleverness, shared meals and protection of the vulnerable were real. Arthur does not have to throw away every memory to condemn the collapse. He can love what was good and still recognise that it has been destroyed. That is a difficult emotional balance, and Arthur reaches it with remarkable grace. Grace is not a word Arthur would likely use for himself, but it fits the final movement of his life. Grace appears when he helps people who cannot repay him. Grace appears when he gives John the hat. Grace appears when he thanks his horse. Grace appears when he admits fear. Grace appears when he faces death without begging the world to call him innocent. he does not become angelic. He becomes truthful, and in a world built on lies, truth itself feels like grace. Arthur's grave, later found by Jon, gives quiet closure to the arc. With high honour, it sits in a beautiful place, overlooking the land, marked with the words, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness." That line matters because Arthur did not spend his whole life righteous. He hungered for it late, painfully, imperfectly. The grave does not pretend he was always good. It honours the direction of his final hunger. He wanted to make something right, even if he could not make everything right. The flowers or barrenness around the grave, depending on honour, speak the same visual language as the buck and wolf. The world remembers the shape of Arthur's choices, not in a childish reward and punishment way, but as atmosphere. A peaceful grave feels like the land accepting him. A harsher grave feels like a lonelier end. Either way, the grave is modest. Arthur Morgan, who carried so much of the story, or ends as a marker on a hill. No grand monument, no statue, just a name, a view, and whatever meaning his final acts left behind. Jon's visit to the grave is not loud, which is right. Arthur's influence on Jon is deep, but not always easily spoken. Jon is not a poetic man in the way Arthur secretly was. He carries feeling awkwardly. But the act of visiting says enough. Arthur mattered. Arthur's sacrifice is remembered. The man who once mocked Jon, saved Jon, and gave Jon his hat becomes part of the foundation under Jon's later life. Even when the future darkens, that foundation remains. Arthur's arc also reshapes how the first Red Dead Redemption feels. Jon Marston's later struggle with his past is heavier, because Arthur already died trying to give him a different future. When Jon is forced back into violence, the tragedy reaches backward and wounds Arthur's sacrifice without destroying it. The government can still drag Jon into the old world, but it cannot erase the years Jon had with Abigail and Jack because Arthur bought them. A temporary peace is still peace. A few years of family are not nothing. This is one of the most bittersweet truths in the whole saga. Redemption does not guarantee permanent safety. Arthur saves Jon from the mountain, but not from history. Jon saves his family for a time, but not from grief. Jack inherits the consequences of both men, yet each act of love still matters because without it, the darkness would arrive sooner and emptier. Arthur's arc teaches that goodness is not measured only by whether it defeats fate forever. Sometimes it is measured by how much life it protects before fate arrives. Arthur's influence on Jack is indirect but meaningful. Jack may not understand the full depth of Arthur's sacrifice as a child, but he benefits from it. He gets years with his parents because Arthur chooses to help Jon escape. He gets a chance, however fragile, to grow beyond the gang's campfires. Arthur, who lost Isaac and could not build a safe life for his own child, helps another child receive more time. That quiet transfer of hope is one of the most moving undercurrents of the story. The tragedy of Jack's later path does not erase that hope. It complicates it. The world of Red Dead Redemption is not gentle enough to promise that saving a child once saves him forever. But Arthur's act still stands. He cannot control every echo. He can only choose not to let Jack die inside the Van der Linde collapse. The fact that later pain follows does not make the earlier rescue false. Human lives are not clean ledgers. They are made of temporary shelters, delayed sorrows, and acts that matter even when they cannot master the ending. The slow tragedy of Arthur Morgan is powerful because it does not ask for cheap forgiveness. It lets the weight remain. He was an outlaw. He hurt people. He collected debts from the desperate. He killed. He followed Dutch too long. He helped build the machine that eventually crushed the people he loved. The story never needs to hide that. In fact, the redemption depends on that truth. A harmless man choosing kindness is pleasant. A guilty man choosing kindness when there is nothing left to gain is profound. The arc is also powerful because Arthur's change is slow enough to believe. Man, he does not wake up one morning as a saint. Doubt gathers, grief gathers, illness gathers, encounters with good people gather, shame gathers, love gathers. Eventually the old identity can no longer hold all of it. The change feels like erosion and revelation at the same time. The hard stone of Arthur's outlaw self wears down, and underneath it was not purity, but a man capable of mercy. That mercy is never abstract. It has names: John, Abigail, Jack, Edith, Archie, Charlotte, Rainsfall, Captain Monroe, Tilly, Mary Beth, Reverend Swanson, Sadie, Charles, even his horse. Arthur's final goodness is relational. He becomes better by responding to people, not by retreating into a private fantasy of being redeemed. This makes his arc deeply grounded. He does not escape into a clean idea of himself. He gets his hands dirty trying to help. His final relationship with himself is perhaps the quietest transformation. Early Arthur often seems resigned to being bad, as if his life is already written. Late Arthur does not suddenly declare himself good. He simply stops letting self-hatred decide his actions. That is a subtle but enormous shift. Self-hatred can be selfish in its own way, because it keeps attention fixed on the self, my guilt, my damnation, my worthlessness. Arthur moves past that enough to ask what others need. In doing so, he becomes less trapped by the question of whether he deserves redemption, and more focused on whether he can offer help. That is why his last days feel freer than Dutch's, even though Arthur is dying and Dutch is still alive. Dutch is trapped inside his self-image. Arthur is released from his. Dutch must remain the leader, the visionary, the betrayed genius, the man with the plan. Arthur no longer has to be the strong enforcer, the obedient son, the man who never admits fear. Death strips him down, and what remains is painful, but freer. He can finally tell the truth, because he has less left to protect. Arthur's ending facing the sunrise is therefore not only sad, it is peaceful in a way his life rarely was. For once he is not chasing a score, not collecting a debt, not waiting for Dutch's next command, not trying to hold the camp together by force. He is still in pain, but the direction of his final act is clear. He helped John, he told the truth, he gave all he had, and at the end there is nothing left to perform. The sun rises on a man who finally belongs to himself. The reason Arthur Morgan remains unforgettable is not that he is the strongest outlaw, the best shot, or the toughest man in the world, even though he is often all of those things. He remains unforgettable because his story understands the ache of wasted time. It understands how long a person can live inside the wrong loyalty. It understands how love can bind someone to a doomed place, how guilt can harden into habit, and how death can make the smallest good act feel enormous. Arthur is not a fantasy of perfect redemption. He is a portrait of late redemption, and late redemption hurts because it arrives with so much already lost. Still, late is not the same as never. That is the final grace of Arthur's arc. He cannot become the man Mary once hoped for. He cannot undo Thomas Downes. He cannot save Hosea or Lenny. He cannot restore the gang. He cannot make Dutch honest. He cannot live to see the full shape of John's future. But he can help. He can choose. He can turn. He can spend his last strength on love instead of pride. In a world as cruel as Red Dead Redemption, that is not a small thing. That is everything. Arthur Morgan begins as a man riding through snow in the service of another man's dream. He ends as a man facing the morning after giving his life for someone else's chance to wake up free. Between those two images is the whole arc. Loyalty becoming doubt, doubt becoming truth, guilt becoming action, fear becoming courage, and violence giving way at last to mercy. The outlaw does not escape death. No one does. But before death takes him, Arthur Morgan becomes more than the life that made him. He becomes the reason another life can continue. There is one more quiet layer to Arthur's arc, and it sits in the way he slowly separates truth from comfort. At the beginning, comfort is staying with the gang, believing Dutch, doing the work, returning to camp, hearing the same voices, and letting the old family rhythm cover the unease. Truth is harder. Truth says the gang is not only hunted, but rotting. Truth says Dutch is not only stressed, but changing. Truth says Arthur is not only unlucky, but guilty. Truth says love does not excuse obedience forever. The entire story can be felt as Arthur moving from comfort toward truth, even when truth leaves him with almost nothing. That movement is painful because comfort was not worthless. The gang really did feed him, raise him, and give him belonging. Dutch really did save him from some other miserable fate. Hosea really did love him. The camp really did hold laughter, music, as friendship and warmth. Arthur's arc would be less powerful if he were escaping something that had always been obviously empty. He is escaping something that once had life in it. That is much harder. It means he has to grieve the good along with rejecting the bad. He has to admit that the place he loved became a place others needed to flee. This is why Arthur's story feels so tied to adulthood. Childhood for him was not innocence but dependence. Dutch's world gave him rules, language, enemies, and purpose. Growing up, emotionally, means realizing that the father does not own the truth. It means seeing the family story as a story, not a law of nature. Arthur becomes fully adult very late, and the cost is terrible. But when he does, he stops asking Dutch for permission to know what he knows. He acts from his own conscience, and that conscience is bruised, imperfect, and finally awake. Arthur's arc also carries the sadness of a man who becomes most beautiful when he is almost gone. That is part of the heartbreak. The best version of Arthur appears when his body cannot stay. The kindness, honesty, humility, and tenderness that might have made a different life possible bloom at the edge of death. This could feel cruel, but it is also what makes the story honest. People do not always become ready for life while there is plenty of life left. Sometimes wisdom arrives as the bill comes due. Arthur cannot keep the wisdom, but he can spend it. The spending of that wisdom is what gives the final hours their power. He spends it on John by telling him to run. He spends it on Abigail by helping return her to her family. Nay, he spends it on Jack by giving the boy a chance to grow somewhere beyond Dutch's collapse. He spends it on the Downes family by helping them escape the misery he helped deepen. He spends it on Rain's fall by trying, however briefly, to honour restraint over exploitation. He spends it on himself by refusing to die as only Dutch's weapon. Every act is a coin from a purse that will soon be empty. Arthur's final goodness is also unspectacular in the best way. It is not about becoming famous. It is not about clearing his name. Most of the world will never know what he did. The law will not understand him. The newspapers will not tell the truth. Respectable society would still call him a criminal and move on. Dutch may never fully admit what Arthur meant. Even John, who remembers, cannot carry the whole complexity perfectly. Arthur's redemption happens largely outside public recognition. That makes it purer. He does not do good because history is watching. He does good because someone in front of him needs it. The lack of public recognition also fits the world of Red Dead Redemption. This is a world where official stories are often false. The government calls violence law, rich men call greed progress, Dutch calls pride freedom, newspapers turn lives into rumours. Against all that noise, Arthur's truest record is private. A journal, a grave, a hat, a few people who survived, a memory in John's voice. The story suggests that a life may be misunderstood by the world and still matter completely to the few it touched. Arthur's arc is therefore not only about becoming good, it is about becoming real. For years he's partly hidden inside roles: outlaw, son, enforcer, debtor collector, gunman, protector, fool for Dutch's faith. Near the end, those roles fall away. What remains is not clean, but it is real. He is afraid, he is sorry, he is angry, he loves, he regrets, he chooses. That reality is more moving than any perfect heroism could be. Arthur does not rise above humanity, he returns to it. The full tragedy of Arthur Morgan is that he could have been many things. His journal shows an artist, his humour shows a sharp observer, his care for Jack shows a gentle guardian, his work with horses and hunting shows a patient outdoorsman, his respect for Charles and Rains Fall shows a man capable of humility, his love for Mary shows someone who once wanted a different home. The outlaw life did not create every part of him, it narrowed him. The final chapter widens him again, just long enough for us to see the man who had been buried under survival. That buried man is why the ending lingers. When Arthur dies, the loss is not only the loss of what he was, it is the loss of what he might have become if time had been kinder, if Dutch had been humbler, if Mary had been reachable, if Isaac had lived, if the gang had ended sooner, if illness had not come through one cruel debt collection. But the story does not live in if. It lives in what remains. What remains is a dying outlaw who chooses at the end to stop serving the lie and serve the living. Seen this way, the slow tragedy of Arthur Morgan is not a straight climb from bad to good. It is a long uncovering. The good was there early, hidden under loyalty, shame, violence and habit. The bad was there too, real and damaging. The illness does not create his conscience. It removes his ability to ignore it. Dutch's collapse does not create Arthur's doubts. It makes the doubts impossible to silence. John's danger does not create Arthur's love. It gives that love its final task, and that may be the deepest reason Arthur's story works. Nothing important appears from nowhere. Every final choice has roots. The man who rescues John in the snow becomes the man who saves John from the gang. The man who helps Mary despite complaining becomes the man who helps others without reward. The man who draws animals in his journal becomes the man who thanks his horse. The man who once collected from Downs becomes the man who helps Edith and Archie leave. The man who once needed Dutch's approval becomes the man who tells Dutch the truth. The ending feels earned because the whole life was quietly preparing for it, even when Arthur did not know. So Arthur's arc can rest in one final image. Not the gun, not the robbery, not the wanted poster, not the myth of the outlaw, but a tired man on a mountain using the last of himself to push another man toward home. That is where all the law, psychology, guilt, love and history gather. Arthur cannot make the world gentle. He cannot defeat time. He cannot save everyone. But he can choose the direction of his last breath. He points it away from Dutch's dream and toward John Marston's future. That is the redemption. Not perfection. Not escape. A final direction. The tragedy is slow because Arthur does not understand it at first. That is the cruel beauty of it. He begins the story already wounded by life, but he does not yet know which wound will become fatal. He knows the gang is in trouble, but he does not yet know the gang is dying. He knows Dutch is under pressure, but he does not yet know pressure will reveal the parts of Dutch that love cannot fix. He knows he has done bad things, but he does not yet know one of those bad things has already placed death inside his chest. The story lets him move for a long time under a sky that is already darkening. Arthur's sadness is not only that he dies. Everyone in Red Dead dies eventually, and the whole series understands that time is always hunting. Arthur's sadness is that he becomes ready for a better life only when the door to that life has closed. He becomes more honest when there is almost no time left to live honestly. He becomes gentler when his hands are already stained. He becomes brave in a deeper way when bravery can no longer save him from the grave. That lateness is what makes the tragedy ache. He is not a good man who simply suffers. He is a guilty man who finally turns toward goodness, and the turn comes at sunset. And now the camp grows quiet again. The fire settles low. Somewhere in the dark, a horse shifts its weight, and the wind moves softly through the trees. Arthur Morgan's story remains behind us like a trail through snow, marked by loyalty, mistakes, sickness, courage, regret, and one final act of love. He could not undo the life he lived. He could not save every person he cared about. He could not make Dutch hear the truth in time. But when the end came close enough that lies were useless, Arthur chose to spend what little strength remained on someone else's future. That is the slow tragedy of Arthur Morgan. Not a perfect man punished by fate, and not a monster suddenly forgiven, but a tired outlaw who discovered his own heart too late and still used it. He rode through a dying world, watched his family collapse, faced the sickness in his body and the guilt in his past, and found one last road toward mercy. The sunrise did not erase him, it received him, and somewhere beyond that mountain, John, Abigail and Jack kept moving for a while, because Arthur Morgan gave them all he had. If you are still awake, you can let the story rest now. Let the hoofbeats fade. Let the lanterns go dim. Let Arthur have his morning on the mountain, quiet and still, with no more debts to collect and no more orders to follow. I hope you sleep well, dream softly, and find a little peace in the dark. Good night.